I have a problem, which is that I don't believe in short, simple, concise explanations of things. It's kind of my whole philosophy is that everything is infinitely complicated, and so to understand anything, you need hours and years of deep contextual background that puts things in, the larger frame of the issues at hand and gives you an understanding of why things are the way they are. And so that makes it very hard to look at a thing like, oh, 5 million people are protesting in Brazil. Wonder why, in like a 10-minute period. But the thing is, people don't watch videos that are 30 minutes long when they want to understand a thing like the protests in Brazil. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to go deep. This video is going to be my deep dive into the history of Brazil, all the context of the politicians who were involved, of the class struggles in Brazil, the history of socialism versus capitalism and dictatorships versus oligarchies versus democracy. There are so many fascinating issues. I swear to God, I've been reading about this. I didn't mean to. I just started reading like a week ago, and I haven't been able to stop reading about Brazil. And there are so many fascinating little nuances to this issue that I think you absolutely need to understand if you really want to understand what's going on in Brazil. But I also know most people don't care that much. Most people are just kind of curious, so they want to hear a cool story, and they want to get jazzed. So that video is coming second. I'm going to make a video that's just about the protests and all the crazy stuff that leaves off all this stuff that I think is super important. So if you're watching this, you're awesome and you're better than the other people who are going to watch that video. I just want to make that clear up front. Fuck yeah for you. So our story starts about 500 years ago. Honestly, obviously, it starts millions of years ago when, the rocks that formed Earth smashed into each other. But even I have to draw the line somewhere. So we're going to start with Portuguese colonization in the year 1500. That's when the Portuguese claim Brazil as their own, in that wonderful way people used to do where they just sort of, I'm sailing through the ocean. Oh, look, land over there. Man, that guy's brown. I own this land now. And so, of course, in Brazil, there were all kinds of different tribes living there. And the Portuguese found them and met them all. And they saw that they were very divided and thus very easy to, oppress and turn against each other and take over and rule. And so for the first 32 years that Brazil belonged to Portugal, they didn't even have a settlement there. They were just like, oh yeah, that gigantic swath of land. Yeah, that's ours. I mean, no one's using it, right? And even after they built the settlement, it wasn't for 2 more years in 1534 that they actually started colonizing the place. And for the first 20 years or so, that was all just about, fighting wars, establishing a foothold, and establishing dominance. Until finally the Portuguese, they had some plantations set up. They were growing lots of cane sugar. They were exporting it back to the empire. And very importantly, they'd started importing lots and lots of slaves from Africa. And then over the next 100 years or so, the sugarcane exports would decline. But luckily, just as they were starting to be like, this Brazil place isn't as cool as we thought, they found gold. And that became the new backbone of the colony's economy. So all kinds of people flooded in, trying to get a piece of that gold rush. And I think here is when we have to start thinking about the type of people that were colonizing Brazil. When we talk about American colonials, we talk about Puritans and, people who were trying to escape the persecution of England and the Quaker. And it's basically like upper middle class people who came and wanted to, establish a place where they could be the king. But in Brazil, what Brazil seems to have attracted, because it is such a resource-rich motherfucker of a continent, it attracts all these people who are just looking to get rich, who are just looking to go and set up, fucking slave-run plantations where they can extract resources and sell them to the crown and become rich people. And that pretty much continues uninterrupted for another 100 or so years until Napoleon starts doing his thing over in Europe. And he actually got super close to Portugal to the point where it terrified the royalty. And the regent, who was ruling in the name of Queen Maria I, basically picked up the court and moved it to Brazil, all the way across the ocean to the colonies, to the New World, which was like unheard of at the time. It's this crazy thing that he did. And by moving the court over there, they established some of the first financial institutions like a stock exchange and a national bank, not just in Brazil, but really in South America. And 1807, America's, going kind of strong at this point, but we're still fighting over whether we should have a national bank. So again, just like you had those resource-hungry settlers in the first place, now you have a financial elite that is ruling over this whole organization. And you have the literal monarchy You want to talk about a way to establish strict class hierarchies. Bringing the monarchy into a plantation world is a pretty good way to set up upper class and lower class. So then eventually Napoleon is defeated, and there's a whole bunch more wars in Brazil, and there's a lot of pressure coming from Portugal. So in order to justify staying in Brazil, I guess because the weather's lovely, I'm not entirely sure why, but the crown established the United Kingdom of Portugal, Brazil, and the Algarves, creating a pluricontinental transatlantic monarchic state. Basically, a country that it goes across the ocean, which didn't really exist. Obviously, everyone had colonies all over the place, but this wasn't a colony. This was a recognized part of the kingdom in Brazil, which of course pissed off the aristocracy over in Portugal because they wanted to be the specially important European folk. And the Brazilians were pretty pissed too because they didn't really want this crown sitting there being all in charge of them. So there's a bunch of revolutions. And then finally in 1821, the king returns to Lisbon. And he left his son as the regent in the Kingdom of Brazil, which a lot of people didn't like. And so there's more revolution. And finally, Prince Pedro declares the country's independence from Portugal in 1822. And then, of course, there's a big war over that for another 2 years. And then finally, in 1824, the last Portuguese soldiers surrender. And Portugal officially recognized Brazil as an independent country. So there's a whole bunch more monarchic politics that basically ends up with a 5-year-old boy being the emperor of Brazil. And then a regency being created to rule in his place, which is not particularly compelling, so we get more revolutions. And things are just generally very chaotic. And so towards the start of this super duper chaotic period, the Atlantic slave trade was officially abandoned because of some shit the British did. But it would take 38 years until 1888, after a long process of internal mobilization and debate, and to finally actually dismantle slavery in the country and informally abolish the institution. And then the next year, after a long period of warfare, after the economy totally crumbling, after slavery, which is really the backbone of the economy, falling apart, there is a military coup where they overthrow the monarchy and take power for themselves. So again, let's compare that to America's independence and America's colonial period. America has this big unifying war where we all kind of come together and we have all these high-minded principles, which are, yes, put together by the rich elite to get the common folk on their side. But still, it is this grand war where they all come together and decide on some ideals and decide that's what the country stands for. And they throw off the British, and it's this great story, and we all love it, even to this day. And right away, we establish a constitution and principles of democracy, and that creates the stability which we rely on to this day. Brazil, on the other hand, has this long, 100-year period of different factions vying for independence and the sort of squabbles between the aristocracy and the monarchy, and a very weak monarchy, and a long economic stagnation and a whole bunch of wars, and finally the military takes over and they set up a republic. And that's how Brazil gets its foundation laid. And so, a little bit to their credit, the military guys, they decide to start a republic, which is nice, the votings and the whatnots. But it was really just a military dictatorship, and the army dominated affairs both in Rio de Janeiro and in all the rest of the states. There was no freedom of the press, elections were controlled by those in power. And the reason that happened is the officers who, joined the military coup to end the empire and bring on the republic actually made an oath to uphold the empire. And they would resolve that contradiction by linking their duty to Brazil itself rather than to the transitory governments in charge. And that's a thing that's going to come back way, way later on when we start talking about the political parties in Brazil today. So just keep it in mind. Remember that this happened. But anyways, the key lesson I want you to take from this period is this right here: rule of the landed oligarchies. That's what was going on. It was just a small group of rich people running the country that was nominally a democracy. And that survives for about 40 years. And over that time, little by little, there's all kinds of general instability, which peaks in this guy, Getulio Vargas, whose running mate got murdered during the election. He loses, but he has the support of most of the military. So he leads the Brazilian Revolution of 1930. Now, he was supposed to only assume power temporarily, but instead, he closed the Congress, extinguished the Constitution, ruled with emergency powers, and replaced the state governors with his own supporters. So around the same time Hitler's coming to power, Mussolini's coming to power, Brazil gets its own little fascist movement. But strangely, as the result of some weird international relations politicking, Brazil actually ends up severing diplomatic relations with the Axis powers and siding with the Allies during World War II. And so then once they win and they defeat fascism, dude can't be a fascist anymore. Seems like it was an incredibly short-sighted move. So he gets sort of swept out of power after World War II ends. And democracy is then reinstated by the exact same army that reinstated it 15 years ago, and we actually ended up with fascism. So that lasts for another 20 or so years until this guy João Goulart assumes the presidency, but was so divisive and pissed off so many people that he was deposed in April 1964 by a coup that resulted in a military regime. And once again, it was intended to be transitory, but it gradually closed in on itself and became a full dictatorship with the promulgation of the Fifth Institutional Act in 1968. So this seems to be the trend of Brazilian democracy. You have some kind of nominal democratic movement that is only allowed to exist because it has the support of the military and the oligarchy, and it gets into power, and then someone goes, hey, you know what would be better if we just scrapped the whole democracy thing, did the whole fascist thing, had a little peace and prosperity, and we all got nice and rich. Fuck those poor people. We're getting them jobs or whatever. But, surprisingly, the military dictatorship does a pretty bad job of running the country. And so they have all these economic problems, they get weak and they piss off the rich planter class. And everything starts moving back to democracy again with this thing called the Amnesty Act, and then a slow sort of march towards election. And the first guy to get elected is this dude, José Sarney, who inherits this slew of problems from the dictatorship and can't solve them all right away. So he gets super unpopular. Then another dude gets elected in '89, Fernando Collor, and he gets impeached in '92, so that's 3 years. And his vice president comes to power, which leaves this guy Fernando Henrique Cardoso as Minister of Finance. And he puts in place this thing called the Plano Real, which after decades of economic shit, finally gets some stability in the Brazilian economy. This is 1994 we're talking about. I was alive. It was 22 years ago. As for what the Plano Real was, it's basically just a bunch of central bank management, fiscal controls and monetary controls that give them a stable currency to work with. The details aren't particularly. So anyways, that guy gets reelected, and then in 2002, this man named Lula da Silva, or Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva, is elected in 2002 and then re-elected in 2006. It's a transition of power from one side to the other for really the first time that's happened peacefully in Brazilian history. Again, to give you guys a little context, for us that happened after our second election, right? So it took Brazil a little bit longer to get to that sort of stable, peaceful, democratically minded place. But they got there, finally, about 20 years ago. Sort of. Because in June 2013, which they're linking to the Arab Spring and Occupy Wall Street here, but this is over a long period of time. I don't know that that's quite a fair connection to make. But anyways, for days, hundreds of thousands of people took to the streets in several cities to protest. And just to give you a sense of what that looked like, here's some pictures. I mean, it's some pretty big deal protest. And initially, it was movements against the increase in public transport fares. But it got huge after the use of excessive force by state police. And then people were angry about all kinds of issues. It got kicked off, the new stadium projects for the World Cup and a bunch of other stuff. Gets a whole bunch of people pissed off and angry in the street. But it has this problem of, because it's so, all kinds of different issues, it doesn't really congeal, it doesn't really focus its power on one specific thing, and kind of nothing happens. But that begs the question, what happened between 1994 when we get this stability and 2013 when everything falls apart and everyone is pissed?